Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to call the meeting to order, please. And just a quick comment before we do roll call. High Street is looking absolutely beautiful, and I wanted to thank, City Manager, if we could, for all the efforts that the folks have put out. I've actually stopped and told them how beautiful it looked, and I think it'd be good if you all do the same. I mean, it's just amazing when they go out and decorate High Street like that. I think it makes the city look absolutely beautiful, so we really appreciate that very much.
Thank you, sir. I was, excuse me, I was into thinking, looking at Mr. Moore on something, but
I'm
thank
sure you
so
have a
much.
lot on your mind, but I wanted to thank you because I know that that's quite an effort, and I've seen the guys out there, and so I've stopped and told them how much that we all appreciate it as citizens. So.
And it looks as if when I'm coming through in the morning, I look at every tree in the aisle, and I'll look, and if I see one out, I'll call Mr. Palmercheck and say, there's one tree out, but let's make sure we address it today. But I will pass that on to him and his team.
I promise you I don't do that, but I do enjoy it. All right, can we do a roll call, please?
Yes, sir, we can. Mr. Barron.
Here.
Mr. Bento.
Here.
Mr. Peterman.
Here.
Mr. Reineberg. Mr. Toops.
Here.
And Mr. Wallace.
Here.
And you have a quorum.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. Guess we'll go right into it. Do you want to start us off, Mr. Moore?
Yes, sir, I'm going to turn to Mr. Jeff Miller to talk about old business, the bond modification for YMCA.
Good morning.
Good morning.
As you may recall, about 5 years ago, PPIC issued bonds to help with some improvements at the Churchland YMCA, and that is one of PPIC's powers. It has the power to issue bonds up to an amount of $10 million per year. And subsequently, the Churchland YMCA was incorporated into the Southampton Roads YMCA. And as part of that, they are reworking their debt. Town Bank, I believe, is the holder of the bonds. They're reworking the debt, and that requires some amendments to the bonds themselves. They do not affect, PPIC has no liability for any bonds that it issues, so there's no impact there for PPIC. But we have today some representatives from Southampton Roads YMCA, and they can present what's going on and what they're seeking approval of from the board.
Hi, I'm Kevin White with Butler Snow Law Firm in Richmond, and I represent the YMCA of Southampton Roads.
Come up here so you can be on the.
Okay.
be heard.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Right here.
Yeah, just in front of the microphone.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kevin White with Butler Snow Law Firm in Richmond. I represent the YMCA of Southampton Roads organization. As Mr. Miller said, the YMCA of Southampton Roads has recently acquired the Portsmouth YMCA, merged in, affiliated with the larger YMCA network in Southampton Roads. One of the things in that merger is, the Portsmouth YMCA had the bond issued through you in 2015 as a pass-through obligation of this commission with no liability to the commission or the city. Essentially a bank loan with Town Bank that's tax exempt because it's a governmental obligation, pass-through obligation. And because of tax reform last year, there were some changes that automatically went into effect in the document to increase the interest rate costs of the bond. So because of that, the bank and the borrower, and of course my client has automatically taken over the liability because of the merger, have agreed to, the bank and the borrower have agreed to modify the bond in order to bring it back to the same basically interest cost level that it was prior to that tax change. So this modification primarily is to accomplish that. There are some bank and borrower covenants that are going to be sort of changed to be more consistent with other covenants that YMCA has with Town Bank and their other loans. But primarily it's the rationale for the change is to keep the interest rate where it was.
Okay.
Where's the interest rate going to now? Where's it set at currently with the new changes?
I can't remember off the top of my head, Susan,
It's
if
in the low
you could.
threes. The rate would have gone to just over 4% with the tax law change last December if it had not stayed the same. So it was, a significant increase in the rate. So all of the loan covenants that the YMCA has with Town Bank on our other bonds, the rate would not have gone up. So this was just a difference in the language that the Portsmouth Y had negotiated with Town Bank versus the YMCA of Southampton Roads. So we're trying to align the financial covenants and the other positive and negative covenants and the rates more with what we see in our other bond documents with Town Bank, which we have 2 others.
Any other questions?
Item 6, it says here, shall be a limited obligation of the commission as far as paying payables. What's that limited obligation for the commission?
It's really a paper obligation, really, because all the obligation to pay interest and principal is undertaken by the borrower in the document. Really, the only thing in a practical sense that this commission may see is if the IRS were to audit the bond, you would receive the letter and then just send that over to the borrower. There would be no effect on the city's credit rating or anything relating to the city. There's no obligation to pay any debt service. The document also has the borrower indemnifying this commission and all of its members for any liability. So it's really, in order to obtain a tax-exempt interest rate, a nonprofit is allowed to borrow through a governmental authority in order to obtain a tax-exempt rate. And so the governmental authority is in the deal just to the extent that that's the role that you have is just to be a conduit to that authority. So that's a limited role.
Yeah, it's essentially a deal between the borrower and the bank, and the limited obligation, I mean, I think it really just means we can't try to interject ourselves and take the borrower's funds and use it for something else as well. I mean, that's it. We don't see the money. It doesn't come through our accounts.
It did come up when it was originally financed, the same issue, because is it an obligation of PPIC, and it's just allowing them to have a better interest rate than otherwise they could. It's not using up any of our capacity, because that was the concern the first time. It's not using up our capacity, it's just allowing us to use something that's part of the code to get them a better rate.
And even the allocation from 2015 of the bank qualified bond, we're not shifting that allocation to this year. It remains
Just answering my
designated as a 2015 BQ.
So it stays with the origination date and doesn't?
That's correct.
Okay. Any other questions?
So we need a motion to approve the modification?
If there are no other
Yes,
questions,
there's a
we do
resolution.
a motion.
Make a motion that we
Accept the resolution.
accept the resolution as presented.
I'll second that.
Okay.
Mr. Barron?
Yes.
Mr. Bento?
Yes.
Mr. Peterman?
Yes.
Mr. Toops?
Yes.
Mr. Wallace?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Next up on the agenda, we have some new business. We have the CYA Sport and Community Center. I'd like to, we have some representatives here we'd like to hear from, please.
Got the phone. Sure. Is this the phone?
Yeah, that's the phone there.
You want to tee it up first?
We have somebody calling in.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. This right here is a request for a new bond issuance that would be issued in 2019. As was mentioned before, PPIC has the capacity to issue up to $10 million in bond debt per year. PPIC's issuance of the bonds does not impact the city's ability to issue bonds or obtain financing, and PPIC and the city are not liable for any bond issuances. This is a project in Chantilly. It's a youth sports facility. And we have here Bill Nussbaum from Williams Mullen to make the request.
I would like to also turn to our finance CFO, Ms. Spivey. I believe we do also have another guest with us in relation to this subject.
Yes, Mr. David Rose with Davenport is here. He's the city's financial advisor.
So he would be here for any questions that the board may have with regards to the financing piece of this, the financial piece.
Good morning. I'm, as Jeff very graciously introduced, and I'm going to introduce, my name is Bill Nussbaum. I'm with the Williams Mullen Law Firm here in Norfolk. I am here as bond counsel and counsel to Freedom Bank of Virginia, which is going to be purchasing this bond. We got a long cord there. Excellent. And on the phone with us is Chris Sabin. Chris is the president of the Chantilly Youth Association, Incorporated, and that is the sole member of CYA Sport and Community LLC. In other words, it owns 100% of CYA Sport and Community LLC. We may also have on the phone with us Duncan Black, who's the attorney for Chantilly Youth Association, also in Fairfax. I confirm.
Yes, I'm here. Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone.
Okay. So we've got, of course, a quorum of the commission here, and I want to start with a heartfelt thank you to the commission for holding this special meeting, and special thanks to Robert Moore and Jeff Miller for making this process work so smoothly, both for this morning's commission meeting and assuming you approve our financing, also in getting us on tonight's city council agenda. Members of the commission, I think you already know this, but you've got two gems on your team in Jeff and Robert. I know you have a busy morning, so briefly what I'm going to do is review why we are financing a facility in Fairfax County through the PPIC. Chris Sabin will tell you briefly about the field house, the Chantilly Youth Association's activities there, and the impact that you're providing this financing will have on their programs. We'll answer any questions you've got, and then your chairman will open the public hearing to receive comments from any members of the public who wish to speak. And then after the public hearing's closed, we hope you'll adopt the official action resolution that we've presented to you. As Kevin White, who I've worked with many times, told you, Congress is determined that nonprofits should be able to borrow tax exempt, and this is essentially what we're talking about here is a bank loan that is run through the PPIC as a conduit where the PPIC will have zero liability for the repayment of the bond. The payment of the bond will be solely and exclusively from coming from CYA Sport and Community Center LLC, with a guarantee by Chantilly Youth Association, the parent. The reason that we are here before you today is that Congress recognized that smaller governmental units and nonprofits often only needed relatively modest-sized tax-exempt loans, and the transaction costs of a publicly sold bond issue with underwriters and a bond trustee were prohibitive for those smaller deals. So to induce commercial banks, like Town Bank in the previous transaction, and Freedom Bank of Virginia in this transaction, to induce commercial banks to buy these smaller deals directly rather than through public offerings, Congress created the bank qualified bond. And that's what we're here, the reason that the YMCA was here previously and why we're here today. A bank qualified bond has to be issued by a qualified small issuer. That's a bond issuer that's selling not more than $10 million in a calendar year. And Congress provided a deduction to those commercial banks that allowed them to reduce the tax-exempt interest rate they'll charge that small government or nonprofit for that interest. But Congress included in its definition of a qualified small issuer that the issuer had to have at least two of the three principal powers of a sovereign governmental body, in order to, and otherwise it had to be lumped in with the larger locality that it was issuing bonds on behalf of. And that's why your EDA, for example, is almost never going to be a qualified small issuer because it doesn't have the power to tax, it doesn't have the police power, and it doesn't have the power to condemn property. Those are the three requirements that the IRS considers to define a sovereign governmental body. But your PPIC, of course, does have the police power, and it does have the power to condemn. So the IRS considers it to be sovereign, and it doesn't have to take into it. You don't have to take into account the bonds that the city of Portsmouth may issue in a given year in determining whether the $10 million limit applies. And so, as you can imagine, the County of Fairfax goes to the bond market every year as well, and certainly issues more than $10 million of bonds. So their EDA could not be a qualified small issuer either. And so we went, since I had been retained and I was in fact involved in getting your charter amended originally to allow you to be able to issue bank qualified bonds because we said it could create an income stream for you. I knew that you all were here, you were convenient across the river from us, from my office, and that this was an opportunity both to get the financing done in a time-efficient manner, as well as which benefits the borrower and the bank, as well as to generate a modest bond administrative fee income stream for your commission on an annual basis. So that's the summary of why we're here. You're issuing the bond will allow CYA Sport and Community Center LLC to obtain that lower interest rate when the bond gets sold to Freedom Bank of Virginia. Right now, it's got an interim conventional acquisition loan for the property, and this would replace that. I'm happy to answer any brief any questions that you might have for that explanation, and then I'll turn the floor over to Chris Sabin on the phone to tell you about the field house and how they're using it. So, does anybody have any questions about my explanation, Councilwoman?
Mr. Sabin, this is Elizabeth Simmons, Vice Mayor of Portsmouth and liaison to this commission. Since this meeting is televised for the benefit of the public, Mr. Nussbaum, I know the resolution calls for a 1%, a half of a percent.
One-tenth of 1%.
1/10 of 1%, I can't get it out, payment to the PPIC as a service fee for this. Can you tell us about how much money that actually is in dollars to this commission?
We're requesting a $4.8 million bond issue. The actual amount, it will be set when we come back at your January meeting with a final bond resolution. It may be somewhere in between 4.8 and 4.7 million, where it's going to depend on what the exact principal amount of the loan is at the time, because they have been making some payments on it. So 1% of 4.7 million would be 47,000, and or 48,000 if it's 4.8 million. 1/10 of 1% would be 4,800. The administrative fee is based on the declining principal balance of the bond, but it's an annual fee and not just a one-time upfront fee. And so it will tail off as principal is paid down, but it's, as long as the bond's outstanding, it's an income stream for this commission.
That's $4,800 per year.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Declining with the principal.
$400
Right.
a month, right?
Well, it's typically a one-time,
One time per annum.
once a year payment.
Yeah.
Now, this is a, go ahead.
Just have a question.
Yes,
What
ma'am.
would Fairfax County have charged? Yeah.
I didn't even ask that question because, to be honest, there was never any possibility of it being issued through them. There was never any possibility of it being issued through them as a bank-qualified bond, so I didn't ask the question.
So the bond is going to go to the bank to administer back to the 501. What is the bank going to be charging?
The interest rate is going to be set at the time, or as we get closer to closing, but it will probably be, from discussions, I think it's probably going to be in the vicinity of a percentage point less than what their conventional acquisition loan interest rate is. And Chris, y'all are currently paying, I think, is it 4.5%? Is that?
Yes, sir.
So preliminary conversations are that it's going to be around 3.5%.
So I just want to get this clear. You're asking us to provide a bond for $4.8 million that we give to a bank at less than 1/10%, and they in turn will go back and charge the CYA 3.5%.
They're lending, they're buying the money. I mean, they're buying the bond, and they're the ones with the capital risk at stake. The bank, I mean, it's a bank loan, essentially. The IRS tax regulations cap what a bond issuing authority can charge at 1/8 of 1%. Otherwise, the bonds become taxable if they charge more than a 1/8 of 1% bond administrative fee. The reason that fee is 1/10 of 1% is, frankly, the Virginia Small Business Financing Authority a couple of years ago started going after trying to essentially buy business by reducing its bond fee from 1/8 of 1% down to 1/10 of 1%, and that just as a market force, it drove local authorities that wanted to issue bonds for issue tax-exempt bonds for nonprofits. It drove down the market rate, basically, to 1/10 of 1%, because they had to compete.
I have a question for, I guess, our council. This bond will post 2019 if it were successful, is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, it'll be a 2019.
Okay, and assuming it's 4.8 million, we have a $10 million cap
Yes,
per year.
annually.
So that would bring us,
For issuances.
for issuances, so that would bring us down to 5.2 that we would be
For 2019.
able to do for 2019.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, it's actually, the $10 million limit is just if you want to be issuing bank-qualified bonds. There is no cap on the amount of bonds Well, it would be a cap for this, you're right, it would be a cap. Because this deal would lose its bank qualified status if you issued more than $10 million of bonds.
Right.
To my knowledge, the YMCA deal is the only other deal over the years that that y'all have issued. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and in fact, I brought that deal to you originally, as well as bond counsel.
Dr. Patton has a question.
Dr. Patton?
Oh, yes, thank you, sir. This CYA Sports Center is located in, did you say Fairfax?
Yes, ma'am, in Chantilly.
In Chantilly. And I guess the public would wonder, why wouldn't they seek the bond issuance through something closer to them? Is Fairfax, have they reached their maximum?
Yes, ma'am. Fairfax, the Fairfax Economic Development Authority would have to be lumped in with the county of Fairfax, with Fairfax County in terms of bond issuances. And certainly, of course, Fairfax County issues more than $10 million of bonds every year, being the largest jurisdiction in the Commonwealth. So it would be impossible to get bank qualified bonds from Fairfax County, from their EDA. We were looking at some rural economic development authorities, but when the transaction slid over into 2019, in terms of timing, we discovered that, we realized that those rural EDAs, which would have to be combined with their localities bond issuing for 2019, they couldn't make a commitment until they'd finished their capital budgeting process, in May or June for 2019. So because those EDAs would have to be combined with the larger locality, unlike your commission. So that's why we sought out a body like this commission.
Is there any way to have this classified as 2018?
There's not, because we also will need to get Fairfax County approval as the host jurisdiction, and that was our goal initially, but the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors was only having one meeting in December, and it wasn't possible to. That meeting was prior to their EDA's meeting. So we'll have a public hearing in January for their EDA, and then go to the Board of Supervisors up there.
I just ask a question. The way I understand this, for the PPIC, there's zero liability, correct?
Exactly.
And it's a guaranteed income stream. Is that a correct statement, too?
It's a guarantee. Yeah, the only thing that would interfere with the guarantee income stream would be if they paid off the bond, or I suppose if they, in the unlikely event that they were to default.
A lot easier to
Either of those things could interfere, but there's no, the bank wouldn't be making the loan if they thought there was a risk of default.
And then the third question is, within Virginia, you kind of explained it pretty well, but who else could do what we're doing, beside the PPIC?
Well, actually the Norfolk Airport Authority, in years that it's not going to the bond market itself for airport-related bonds, is a bank-qualified issuer, because likewise it has, the airport police, and it has the power to condemn. Redevelopment and housing authorities, if they're not issuing bonds, they also, I believe, have the police power and certainly the power to condemn. So I think they could be bank-qualified. But with the somewhat robust market in multifamily housing bonds, they usually, most of them consume it issuing housing bonds. So.
Okay, and I guess the last question would be for Mr. Moore. Are there any other competing efforts, for PPIC?
for next year, we need.
Yeah.
This is
So-
December.
So what I'd like to do is, Ms. Spivey, would you?
Appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is David Rose. I think some of you know me. I've had the good fortune of working with the city now for about a decade. I spoke to Mr. Nussbaum last evening at the request of the city, and as y'all's financial advisor, my thinking and thoughts are solely in the best interest of the city. So having said that, I think there's a few issues here that I'd just like to address. Number one, knowing that the city will go to the bond market this coming year, meaning 2019, and certainly do that well in excess of $10 million. I asked Mr. Nussbaum specifically if this financing that's contemplated and if approved by the PPIC would have any bearing whatsoever on the city from a perspective of tax exemption or what have you, and the answer was no, for the reasons that Mr. Nussbaum pointed out, which is, again, that sovereign, I'll call it the sovereign clause or clauses, and that was fine. The second thing, as y'all heard, you can go to 1/8 of 1%, but that is a negotiation. That's not my input, but that is something that you potentially could do. You're at 1/10 of 1%, at least to the proposal. So that could add perhaps another effectively 20% of that roughly 4,800 declining per year. The third issue, though, I think is one that I can't answer, but this is one that particularly I think the City Council, Ms. Simmons and your colleagues on the City Council have got to feel comfortable, and that is the trade-off for this effectively, let's say almost $5,000 in the first year and then declining. How many years is this bond planned?
It's going to be a long-term financing. You know, it's going to be 20
years.
probably
So
20 or
you
longer
think of it
years,
as it's
I
a
suspect.
normal
Amortization.
Okay, so from that perspective, then you're basically going to have a roughly $25,000 or so dollars over the 20 years, maybe 30,000.
No, it would be,
50,000.
you're talking about, you know, over the,
Declining principal.
yeah, declining principal, it's going to be substantially more than that because you're going to be paying mostly interest in those
Oh, you will? Okay, well,
first years.
fine. Good.
Just like on your home mortgage. a
Okay, it's going to
30-year
be
home
more like
mortgage.
that as opposed to level principal. That's
Yeah,
right.
it'll be level payments of principal and interest, I expect.
Okay, fine. So I think really the issue, and it's something I can't answer, and neither can Ms. Nussbaum, and that is going into 2019 for the calendar year, not fiscal year, but calendar year, will you, with the prospects of, let's say, round it off, roughly having, let's say, $5 million available versus $10 million, be putting yourself at any competitive disadvantage as it relates to the city for a project? And I can't answer that. Now, what I can say is that if you find it, let's say this project, for argument's sake, went all the way to 10 million, it's not, but it did, what that would then mean is, and this happens pretty typically, is that there are other EDAs and other financing conduits that, let's say, something like a Surrey County, a Sussex County, any number of other entities could be out there as possible conduits for you. So that's just something to keep in mind. But that's really my take on it here. I'm comfortable as your advisor that if you approve this, it's going to have no impact on your credit rating. It is truly a pass-through. So from that perspective, just like the previous financing that was talked about in terms of resetting rates, it's the same. So from that perspective, no harm to the City Council. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Patton, please.
And the person, and thank you, sir, Mr. Rose, for your comments. The financial advisor to our city council and to the city manager is Mrs. Spivey. And I am going to ask her to speak as where she feels we should go as it relates to this that is before you. Ms. Spivey, you just go upstairs. Right there.
Yes. Good morning. Cheryl Spivey, Chief Financial Officer for the City of Portsmouth. Based on what Mr. Rose has said and what the attorneys have said, you're looking at the possibility of up to $5,000 a year.
Close to it.
To plus.
I said close to it.
Okay, close to $5,000 a year to essentially give up our bank qualification for the difference between 10 million and what this issuer will, and this one for the whole 2019. So the question is it worth it? I mean, if there's a possibility of an opportunity out there for PPIC to need to have the ability to borrow at the lowest cost of money, then this would be giving up a portion of that.
Okay, thank you. Vice Mayor, you had a comment,
I
please.
do. This is probably for Ms. Spivey, or maybe for Mr. Rhodes. In my tenure on council, I've never seen the PPIC bond for a Portsmouth City project. Can it, or does it have to be for something else?
Again, it can be just as it here is for something as far away as Fairfax County or in Fairfax County.
But could we
So-
use it for something in Portsmouth?
Yes.
Yes.
Certainly
Okay.
could.
The deal that you just considered was for the
Well, let
YMCA.
me rephrase that. Could we use the PPIC bonding capacity for a city project? Not a nonprofit in the city?
A PPIC project
Through the
Well,
PRC.
Through the PPIC.
through the PPIC?
Yeah, through the PPIC?
I mean, it just depends upon the nature of why it would go through PPIC
But you
versus the
could.
city. Because if it's a city project, again, just have to have some unique, I'd say relatively unique legal structure. But otherwise, the most straightforward we've typically done has been through the EDA or, of course, through the city
Or
itself.
through the city?
But PPRC could.
Yeah, it could, of course, yes.
Go ahead, Jim.
If I understand it right, this is a very specific program that allows up to 10 million for a very specific purpose. PPIC, in its normal thing, could have other issuance, but that's one of the things, this doesn't count against it. So it's a very specific program for each entity that's up to 10 million, if I understand it right, for things that qualify for it.
Bank qualified.
But it's, PPIC, under its other kind of charter, could do other things. We just haven't since
Done
I've been
them.
on.
Mr. Benta, I'm going to speak. I would like to just make the point that this commission has, to my knowledge, has never issued bonds on its own account previously, for, what we would call a general obligation bond for any of its own projects. And it has not, similarly, it has not, other than the YMCA of Portsmouth financing that came back before you today, has never issued any other bonds.
Is that a statement of fact? I mean, that's true?
Yeah,
Yeah.
To my knowledge,
yeah,
it
that
is.
is
yes.
And in fact, that YMCA of Portsmouth deal, I can tell you, because I was the bond counsel on it, originally was financed as a bank qualified deal through the Industrial Development Authority of the town of Mount Jackson, Virginia, up in the Valley of Virginia. And when we were getting ready to do some modifications of it, some refinancing of it, that was at the time that I came to the, and Eric Hauser, my former partner, came to the PPIC and said, we could modify your charter in order to, and we went to the General Assembly and got it modified for the PPIC so that y'all can, the City of Portsmouth would not be missing out on this income stream. There are lots of bank-qualified issuers around the Commonwealth that profit from getting bond administrative fees And I can promise you that no project that for a Portsmouth charity that might come up later this year would go unfinanced for the inability, even if they wanted $7 million of bonds, just because the PPIC had used $4.8 million for this project. There are plenty of rural EDAs out there, Isle of Wight, Sussex, as David Rose mentioned. You get out further out, you just need a bond counsel with a little bit of, who knows people around the state. And it's easy to identify who can be, those other bank qualified issuers. It's just the fact that we wanted to move early in the year, so we came to a bank qualified issuer who wasn't constrained by the locality's capital budgeting like an EDA would be. So, but no project for a Portsmouth nonprofit would go unfinanced as a result of your collaborating with CYA on this financing.
I think, go ahead.
Again, I apologize for asking questions that may be redundant, but the reason that we can only go to 1/8% is because of tax concerns?
Yeah, and the regulations in the Treasury regulations issued by the Internal Revenue Service limit the fee to, the annual recurring fee to 1/8 of 1%.
Keep it
Yeah.
non-taxable. So if we went to 1%, our big recourse would be the fact that we had to pay taxes on $48,000 versus not paying taxes on
No,
$4,800.
what would become taxable would be the interest that Freedom Bank would get on the bond. There would be no financing. If you went to 1%, there would be no financing because it would not be a tax-exempt bond. And there'd be no income stream for the commission.
Part of this hearing is that we do have to have a public hearing, and if there's anyone here that would like to speak.
Did you want to hear from Mr. Saban at all about the facility, or is that?
Well, I think.
Or you heard enough?
I would put that out to the commission. I've read it pretty thoroughly.
Okay.
I don't think
have
there's
too.
anything questionable or wrong with the facility. It sounds
Okay.
very nice. But
Great. Thank you.
So I'll defer to if there's anyone here that would like.
There are two hands.
Come on, Doc.
The public hearing's now open.
Yes, the public hearing is now open, yes. Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Donna Sy, and I live in the Woodbine Farms neighborhood. I was really shocked when I heard about all this. I've got my presentation written up, but in it, the capital will refinance a conventional mortgage that financed a purchase of 2 parcels of real property and a building with improvements. So I'm wondering, you already got a loan. Why are you refinancing it? Okay, that's one of the things. And my understanding for the Port and Industrial Commission is that we're concerned about the port, industrial stuff around. And this board hadn't even met 12 times this year. They don't have any, business to attend except when somebody wants to use us for money. There was nothing in the rules and regulations that the PPIC gives the commission authority to refinance a conventional mortgage loan for 2 parcels of real property and a Northern Virginia field house with improvements. But in Rule 25, it does read that the commission has power to provide financing for a 501c3 organization. One of the things underneath it all that really concerns me about this is we have a sports complex, right? We have one. They have one. They're planning to do something, with it. But we have to use CDBG funds to repair it. In fact, I recall my brother graduated from the old Frederick Military Academy back in '62. That's my first time coming to Portsmouth. I didn't know I was going to come back 15 years later and get involved in government. But that's my concern, too, underneath it all. And so that's what I'm concerned about. It's all about money. It's all about money.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. Mark Gaduldi-Gutrovsky, 2713 Sterling Point Drive in the city of Portsmouth. There's a literary statement about what the law is, and the characterization begins with an A. Tax law is a double A, and that's not a bond rating. This process seems extremely Byzantine. And I am not here to speak against doing what has been requested. The organization that will be on the receiving end of this certainly seems like a worthy organization. And I'm not overly concerned about the limitation, the ceiling on what this body can issue being exceeded in the coming year. Again, as Mr.
Nussbaum.
I was going to say Mullins. Mr. Nussbaum pointed out there are other sources for funding anything that may come along in the city of Portsmouth that requires this kind of funding. But certainly it would be helpful if Congress would find a way to simplify this process so it wouldn't be necessary to shop around the Commonwealth of Virginia to fund a need in any particular locality that fit within the tax code. Perhaps that should be part of a future year's legislative packet request from the Virginia Municipal League. The only question that remains in my mind is there's an item that will be on tonight's City Council agenda involving a loan to the Economic Development Authority from the city so that the Economic Development Authority can satisfy a legal agreement clawing back a piece of property that had been sold previously, but for which the requirements of that sale had not been met. And I have no heartburn about enforcing the provisions of an agreement. But I am wondering if the EDA would be one of the organizations that would qualify for a loan of this type, because they will have to obtain financing on the back end to repay the loan to the city. However, I've done the math, and the amount that's being requested here, even in combination with the amount that the EDA needs to meet its requirements, does not breach the limit. But I did not, I'm not clear in my mind, and I don't know whether it would be in order for there to be an answer to that question, whether that's something that just hangs in the air going forward, whether EDA qualifies as a recipient of one of these bond arrangements. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Is there anyone else? Public comment? So we need to go ahead and close the public hearing at this point. Thank you very much. Any more comments from the commission?
Just to clarify, this $10 million limit is for 1 year. So as of January 1, 2020, if we were to do this year, we go back up to our $10 million authorization.
Is that fiscal or calendar?
That's correct.
Calendar.
Calendar year?
Calendar year. not
Okay.
fiscal.
So this obligation essentially to us is for a period of 1 year, 12 months. That would reduce our bonding authority. Okay.
Can I ask one other question? Is why haven't we done this before? Nobody asked?
We haven't been asked.
I've been on the PPIC for quite some time, and I don't remember it coming across
The
the table.
yeah, you're too well kept of a secret.
Yeah, only Mr. Nussbaum has brought us requests in the past.
Yeah. It's,
Dr. Patton,
I
please.
would say that it's not so much that it's a well-kept secret. I would say that the citizens of Portsmouth and the organizations in Portsmouth are not aware of it. And therefore, that's why no organization such as this one in Chantilly has come forward to its own PPIC to seek such funding.
I think that's a fair statement. I guess part of this is where it was kind of thrown at us this morning, and so there's a lot of questions and a lot of we're trying to absorb. Just to be clear, I understand how the bond issue works. Been there, been through it, but I guess this body hasn't even contemplated this until today. So that was kind of a difficult situation.
And just to make sure I understand, Mr.
Sure.
Nussbaum, this is for a qualified nonprofit. It's not that. It is a very narrow kind of thing that's just per the code. And I heard you say, and I just want to make sure that if we ended up finding something in Portsmouth that made sense, essentially we could, if it went above what the threshold is for 10 million next year, we could do the same thing that Fairfax is doing and find another locality that maybe has capacity, so that realistically, it hasn't been an issue in the past, but if it was, that it would not keep a Portsmouth entity from finding the same financing.
That's correct, Mr. Toops.
Can't say in certainty, but
In the 25 years that I spent as counsel to the Norfolk EDA, I can tell you that with regularity, the city of Norfolk granted its approval to, I could rattle off any number of bond financings that were issued by rural EDAs in Northampton County, Essex County EDA, Lancaster County EDA, Isle of Wight EDA, all come to mind that have issued bank qualified bonds for nonprofits that had facilities in the city of Norfolk. So it goes on a lot, and as I said, Portsmouth, the YMCA of Portsmouth was a beneficiary of a bank qualified deal that was issued by a little town's IDA up in the Shenandoah Valley initially. So it's just a matter of convenience and taking advantage of provision in the in state law and federal tax law that helps nonprofits to borrow as inexpensively as possible to help their charitable purposes.
And again, if the CYA defaults, I'm not saying that they're going to, but if they did in the 20-plus years, what's our obligation at that point in time?
Zero.
We don't.
Zero.
We don't,
The bank
the
would.
note is
the
no,
bank
the
would.
bond is just.
The bank forecloses on the real estate and.
We just lose the revenue stream.
At some point you lose your income stream. You're completely exculpated. You're completely.
I know we have to look at this resolution, but I guess one last thing I'd like to say is we have the benefit of the city manager and the vice mayor here, and if you have any counsel for this body, we appreciate that.
I don't have any problem with it, personally. I mean, I was here during the time when Mr. Nussbaum brought the charter change, and we did the financing for the YMCA originally. I don't see any problem with it, frankly. I mean, I'm gonna have to vote on it too, later.
Right, exactly.
So I don't have a problem.
As city manager, there are so many unknowns when it comes to what this city will need tomorrow. None of us know. And so I have to always, as I work very closely with our financial advisor and our CFO, just be right here to say, we don't know. I do know, as I said, that the greater good of Portsmouth organizations or groups that could qualify, we surveyed them. We haven't made it known. We have not shared just this kind of financial backing that they could have for whatever it is that they want to do. So that is where I am, and there, as we all know, as we live day to day, you never know what we may need.
Thank you. Any further comment from the commission?
Are we being asked to actually adopt this resolution at this point? Do we have any opportunity to sidebar amongst ourselves or closed session, or we just?
I think we could go into closed on it if you'd like.
I leave that up to the chair, but I'd like to make sure that we, as a body, are in lockstep one way or the other.
I think I agree with that. It was, again, we just got, this came at us so quickly, and I just want to, I think we all understand the mechanics of it, but I just want to make sure that we're comfortable. I think some of the hesitation, so everyone will understand, is that we have other projects pending, and we need to contemplate where that might go with these funds. So at this point, Robert, could you get us a resolution to go into closed session, please?
Sure.
Whereas the Virginia Freedom of Information Act provides that the Board of Commissioners may hold closed meetings for certain purposes set forth in paragraph 2.23711A of the Code of Virginia 1950 as amended, and whereas in compliance with the requirements of the Code, the topics to be discussed are set forth below. Now therefore be it resolved that the Board of Commissioners shall meet in closed session for the purpose of discussing or considering the investment of public funds where competition or bargaining is involved, where if made public initially, the financial interest of the governmental unit would be adversely affected, water delivery facilities, and proposed bond issuance.
So we need a
Public funds.
motion.
Motion to go into closed session, please?
So motion.
Second.
Mr. Barron?
Yes.
Mr. Benzo?
Yes.
Mr. Peterman?
Yes.
Mr. Toops?
Yes.
Mr. Wallace?
Yes.
No, not your fault.
Whereas the Commission has convened a closed meeting on this date pursuant to an affirmative recorded vote in accordance with the provisions of the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, now therefore be it hereby resolved that each Commissioner, unless his or her prior contrary statement is in the minutes of this meeting, hereby certifies to the best of his or her knowledge, 1, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under this chapter, and 2, only such public business matters as were identified in the motion by which closed meeting was convened were heard, discussed, or considered in the closed meeting by the Commissioners.
We have a motion. Do we have a motion?
A motion and a second.
Yep.
So, Peterman, and who was the other? Wallace.
Guy?
Mr. Barron?
Yes.
Mr. Benzo?
Yes.
Peterman?
Yes.
Mr. Toops? Mr. Wallace?
Yes.
All right, we're in open session. We need to vote on the
Motion on the bond.
motion on the bond.
So we need a motion for...
Yes, we need a motion.
Okay, we need a motion on the resolution evidencing the official intent of the Portsmouth Port and Industrial Commission to issue its bank-qualified revenue bonds for CYA Sport and Community Center, LLC.
So moved.
Is that with the 1/8 of 1%?
If we need to make that
We'll have a
amendment now.
discussion once we have the second.
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 No. It's got to be part of the motion.
It's in the resolution.
Okay, well, I would like to make the motion with the amendment that the rate be at the 1/8 of 1%,
In 2019.
2019. that's possible to do.
To be issued in 2019.
Yes.
Issued in 2019 with the 1/8
Yeah.
1/8 of 1%.
1%.
Okay.
Fee.
Second.
Second?
Mr. Barham,
Yes.
Toops. Mr. Barham is yes. Mr. Bento?
Yes?
Mr. Peterman?
Yes?
Mr. Toops? Yes. Mr. Wallace? So motion carries with those changes.
Okay.
All right, you don't have anything?
Okay, well,
How
thank
about
everybody.
the YMCA? Is that already done?
That's,
That was
I
it?
think we did that already.
You did.
Okay, very good, okay.
And this,
One more, just with saying.
Well, yeah, the city will go
We'll come
back
back with-
to Mr. Hargrove.
we're not taking any action with this West Norfolk
That
thing
was
right
my
now.
question.
Now, the city will just suggest our intent to carry forward with that.
Sign those resolutions, right?
Those have to be changed. I'll talk to him after.
Okay, any other business?
I think we're done.
Move to adjourn?
Motion adjourned.